Think about this. You've spent your life reacting, choosing, and adjusting, often without fully knowing why. Maybe you felt out of sync in crowded meetings, drained after conversations, or confused when others thrive in situations you find overwhelming. Now imagine this. You've been operating with the wrong mental software all along, like running high-speed engineering software on an outdated machine. It works, but just barely. We open on a bustling city street. Noise, rushing bodies. One man stands still, lost in thought, sketching something in a notebook. In another scene, a woman hesitates to answer a simple question at work, her mind spiraling with what others might think. And in the background, the haunting quote echoes. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. That's Carl Jung. And his idea, that your psyche runs on a framework. A very specific framework. Jung didn't just talk about personalities. He mapped the blueprint of the human mind. Not in vague traits like friendly or funny, but in structured functions. Ways we absorb, process, and act on the world. Most people know the introvert versus extrovert bit. But that's just the surface. Beneath that is a complex dance between thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition, and how they shape your decisions, relationships, and even your fears. And here's the kicker. If you don't know your dominant function, the one lens through which you naturally process life, chances are you're misinterpreting your own strengths. Worse, you're also blind to the one part of yourself that secretly sabotages you. The inferior function. That buried part of your psyche you've avoided for years. The part that bursts out in emotional meltdowns or self-sabotaging decisions when pressure builds. This video is your map. By the time we're done, you won't just understand the 4 core personality functions Jung revealed. You'll pinpoint which one's running your life, which one's quietly haunting it, and what to do about both. You'll also learn how the brain actually lights up differently depending on your type. Why our ancestors needed diversity of personality just to survive, and how big tech now uses personality data in ways that affect your daily life more than you realize. So stay with me, because once you understand your mental operating system and how to update it, everything changes. Now let's begin where people get it most wrong. The 2 attitudes we keep misunderstanding. We throw the words introvert and extrovert around like casual labels. Party lover, quiet thinker, shy, bold. But what if we've completely misunderstood them? Carl Jung warned about this very confusion. To him, these weren't social behaviors. They were internal directions of energy. You could be the life of the party and still be an introvert. You could enjoy long walks alone and still be an extrovert. It's not about your crowd size. It's about where your mind naturally goes to recharge. Introversion, in Jungian terms, isn't about avoiding people. It's about turning inward, toward thoughts, memories, ideas, and private reflections. It's an energy that flows inward. When an introvert is tired, they don't need quiet. They need solitude to reconnect with their inner world. On the flip side, an extrovert doesn't just crave noise or crowds. They feel most alive when energy is exchanged outward. Their thoughts sharpen in interaction. They make sense of life through movement, connection, activity. Modern neuroscience backs this up in stunning ways. In fMRI scans, introverts show more blood flow in the frontal lobe and anterior cingulate cortex, regions linked to self-reflection, deep thinking, and mental simulation. They're literally wired to go inward. Extroverts, their brains light up in the amygdala and posterior thalamus, processing reward and excitement faster, especially in social contexts. A 2023 study in Nature Human Behavior confirmed that introverts prefer environments where the default mode network, DMN, is active, meaning they process their world in stillness, contemplation, and internal dialogue. Meanwhile, extroverts are wired to activate salience and attention networks, thriving on real-time feedback loops from the world. And yet, we mislabel people all the time. A quiet manager is dismissed as cold. A chatty teenager is called shallow. Our culture often overvalues extroversion, linking it to leadership, confidence, and charisma. But it misses the truth. Introverts are often the quiet strategists, holding entire mental blueprints in their heads, waiting for the right moment. Jung believed these attitudes were not moral preferences, but simply the polarity of how we engage with life. One of the most overlooked texts that expands on this is The Attitude Types by Yolanda Jacobi, one of Jung's closest students. In her work, she emphasizes how these attitudes affect not just energy, but memory, perception, even dreams. For example, introverts tend to store emotion-laced memory differently, with vivid internal imagery, while extroverts anchor memory to events, people, and shared experience. Jacobi also warned that modern education systems often stifle introverts, favoring fast answers over quiet incubation of ideas. That's a problem. Think about how this affects your self-perception. Maybe you've thought you were awkward in social settings, but really, you just weren't recharging in a way your nervous system needed. Or maybe you assumed your need to talk it out was a flaw. But that's just your natural cognitive rhythm. When we confuse the direction of energy with behavior, we set ourselves up for years of inner conflict. Understanding your orientation isn't about slapping on a label. It's about tuning your life to the right rhythm. Because if your world forces you to process energy in a way that's unnatural to your psyche, it's like forcing a river to flow uphill. So take a moment to reflect. After a long day, where does your mind go? Inward or outward? Stillness or stimulation? Your answer isn't just personality. It's the foundation for every decision, relationship, and burnout you've ever had. And now that we've corrected the compass, it's time to map the terrain. Because under these two attitudes lie the real engines of the psyche, the four core functions. The four cognitive functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. Every decision you've made, every time you've said yes, no, or maybe, has been shaped by one or more of these: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. Carl Jung proposed these four cognitive functions, not as personality quirks, but as fundamental mental tools we use to interpret and navigate reality. Most people aren't even aware of which function is driving their choices, but once you spot yours, you begin to understand why you respond the way you do, to pressure, love, conflict, or creativity. These aren't traits. They're modes of perception. And each one tells a different story about how your mind sees the world. Let's make it real. Picture someone standing at a crossroads, faced with a tough decision. A thinking type will quickly begin analyzing facts, patterns, and logical consequences, detached from emotion, hunting for the most efficient solution. You might hear them say, "What makes the most sense here?" That's their compass. A feeling type? They'll scan the emotional temperature of themselves and others. They evaluate values, fairness, and inner alignment. It's not about being emotional. It's about prioritizing harmony, integrity, or human connection. Their inner voice says, "What's right? And how does it affect those involved?" Now switch scenes. Imagine someone walking into a new room. A sensing type will notice the lighting, the scent of coffee, the texture of the chair, details rooted in the present moment. Their mind is anchored to physical reality, grounded in what is. An intuitive type? They're already projecting ideas. That crack in the wall reminds them of an old book. The placement of chairs sparks a vision for rearranging the entire space. They aren't bound by the present. They're dancing with possibilities. Where sensors see what is, intuitives see what could be. These aren't rigid boxes. Each of us uses all four functions, but one tends to lead. And that dominant function shapes your entire personality structure. Neuroscience is beginning to catch up. A study from the Max Planck Institute showed that people who prefer sensing have denser connectivity in parietal regions associated with spatial and sensory input. Meanwhile, those inclined toward intuition show greater activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region tied to novelty, imagination, and future simulation. John Beebe's work, especially in psychological types, a revision, goes deeper. He maps these functions not just as thinking tools, but as a personal myth. For example, he describes each function as a character in an internal drama: the hero, dominant; the ally, auxiliary; the trickster, tertiary; and the shadow, inferior. These aren't metaphors. They're reflections of how the psyche organizes itself. In therapy, Beebe found that most people's recurring life conflicts trace back to the blind spot caused by ignoring one of these functions. NASA, of all places, has understood this intuitively for years. During high-stakes missions, they pair engineers with dominant thinking functions with communicators who lead with feeling, balancing cold precision with warm morale. In fact, their pre-launch simulations involve personality testing, not to decide who's best, but to make sure no function is missing from a team. That's not strategy. That's survival. So here's something simple you can try right now. Think back to a conflict you had last month. Did you focus more on what made logical sense, or on how it affected people? Were you concerned with facts in front of you, or were you sensing something beneath the surface? That small reflection can begin to reveal which function dominates your internal operating system. And now that you've glimpsed how these functions shape your perception, we'll unlock the next puzzle. Because your dominant function isn't alone, it has a partner. And together, they run the entire show. Dominant plus auxiliary, your internal power couple. If your dominant function is the engine of your mind, then the auxiliary is your navigation system. It doesn't drive, but it tells you where to go, how to adapt, when to slow down, and when to turn back. Carl Jung emphasized that our psyche seeks balance, not perfection. And the way it tries to create that balance is through this internal pairing. The dominant and auxiliary functions working together like a seasoned duo. Understanding this relationship is like finding the hidden gears behind your everyday reactions. Why you clash with some people, why you freeze under certain types of pressure, and why some environments make you come alive. Let's start with how this plays out in real life. Imagine a grandmaster in chess. In the heat of a timed match, their dominant function, say, introverted thinking, calculates positions, options, logic trees. But under time pressure, their auxiliary, perhaps extroverted intuition, steps in to scan broader patterns, project future threats, and inject rapid creativity. The moment they win, it's not because of brute logic. It's because their inner system was balanced, a sharp lead, supported by an agile scout. Neuroscience backs this up. A 2022 study published in Brain and Behavior used fMRI to scan chess experts during blitz games. It found that intuitive regions in the right anterior insula lit up only in players whose auxiliary function was intuition, especially under time pressure. They weren't just calculating. They were flexing both sides of their cognitive team. So how do you figure out yours? Here's a quick self-reflection quiz. First, ask yourself, when you make decisions, do you lean more toward analyzing facts or empathizing with feelings? That helps you determine whether thinking or feeling is more dominant. Now the second question, do you trust your gut hunches and future possibilities, or are you grounded in the present and what your five senses can confirm? That points to sensing or intuition. Combine those two insights, and you're already circling your dominant function, your auxiliary. It's usually the opposite orientation in the other axis. If you're a dominant thinker, your auxiliary might be feeling. If you lead with intuition, your auxiliary could be sensing. Not always, but often. In Angelo Spoto's quietly powerful book, Understanding Yourself Through Typology, he outlines how people often get stuck in life not because of trauma or laziness, but because their auxiliary function has been neglected. He gives the example of a man whose dominant function was extroverted thinking, driven, organized, and highly efficient. But he kept burning out and struggling with creative blocks. Therapy revealed he'd been suppressing his auxiliary introverted feeling, his capacity to check in with what he valued, not just what was efficient or useful to others. Once he began reconnecting with his personal values, even journaling 5 minutes a day, his work took on new clarity and ease. This is where Jung's insights blend perfectly with behavioral psychology. In early childhood, our dominant function emerges naturally, but the auxiliary develops later, usually in adolescence or early adulthood. It's the function we often have to grow into, which is why it becomes our stabilizer. Thinkers need a heart, feelers need a plan, sensors need vision, intuitives need grounding. It's not about change, it's about expansion. When you ignore your auxiliary function, you become rigid. When you develop it, you become agile. That's what self-awareness really means. Not knowing who you are in a fixed sense, but understanding how your mind prefers to operate and what it needs to operate well. So the real question now isn't just, what's your dominant function? It's, what have you been ignoring that's actually trying to help you grow? Because as we'll see next, the part of yourself you ignore the most, the one that frustrates or embarrasses you, isn't just a weakness, it's the shadow power you've been running from. The inferior function, your kryptonite and secret superfuel. There's a part of you that you've probably dismissed, mocked, or buried. The part that feels clumsy, uncomfortable, maybe even childish. And yet, it's the same part that tends to erupt in moments of crisis. This is what Carl Jung called the inferior function. He saw it not as a flaw, but as the hidden twin of your dominant function, the part you spend your life avoiding until one day, you can't. And when it breaks through, it doesn't knock. It crashes the whole system. The inferior function is always the least developed, least trusted aspect of your psyche. It operates unconsciously and often appears in dreams, projections, or sudden emotional meltdowns. Picture a highly rational CEO, clear, logical, always in control. But when his marriage falls apart, it's not logic that floods him. It's a sudden, overwhelming emotional storm. He can't think straight. He feels lost, unanchored. That's his inferior function, feeling, bursting through after decades of neglect. The same function he used to dismiss in others is now the one hijacking his life. Jung warned that this function is both our kryptonite and our superfuel. He famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The inferior function doesn't disappear if ignored. It waits. It becomes the source of neurosis, projection, and compulsive behavior. Think about times when you've overreacted emotionally, said something out of character, or sabotaged something you cared about. Odds are, your inferior function was involved. Modern psychology continues to confirm Jung's insight. Gerhard Adler, in The Living Symbol, explains how the inferior function often becomes symbolized in art, myths, and recurring dreams. He describes the case of a man dominated by sensing, precise, structured, grounded. But his recurring dream was always a flying through space, untethered, overwhelmed by visions and possibilities. Adler interpreted this as his neglected intuition crying for recognition. And when the man finally took a break from his rigid corporate life to explore photography, capturing abstract imagery, he felt a profound shift in mental clarity and emotional peace. Even neuroscience supports this paradox. A 2021 study in Frontiers in Psychology explored how engaging in activities that stimulate one's inferior function, like intuitive types doing hands-on crafts or thinking types practicing mindfulness, increases neural plasticity and overall well-being. The brain doesn't just tolerate what's unfamiliar, it grows stronger when you stretch it. There's something powerfully human about this. We aren't just the things we're good at. We are also the parts we've neglected, feared, or misunderstood. That's why individuation, the process of becoming whole, in Jung's view, requires us to integrate this fourth function. Not to master it, but to build a relationship with it. You don't have to become a master feeler, or a visionary prophet, or a pragmatic doer. But you do have to invite your shadow to sit at the table. So ask yourself, what kind of person really gets under your skin? Someone too emotional, too rigid, too impulsive, too abstract? The person you can't stand may represent your own inferior function in raw, unrefined form. The psyche does this. It mirrors what we suppress, not to punish us, but to point us inward. Once you begin to recognize the inferior function in your day-to-day life, it stops ambushing you. You stop projecting it onto others, and most importantly, you gain access to a whole new kind of energy, one that doesn't drain you, but completes you. And just when you think this is all metaphorical, the science steps in again. Because brain scans, EEGs, and cognitive mapping are now showing something incredible. The inferior function has its own neural fingerprint. And that's where we go next. Neuroscience meets typology. For decades, Jungian typology was dismissed as too abstract, too philosophical, even too poetic for modern science. But now, neuroscience is catching up, and what it's revealing is electrifying. The 4 cognitive functions Jung described aren't just psychological metaphors. They're wired into the brain itself. The way you think, feel, sense, and imagine. Each has a measurable, observable pattern in your neural circuitry. And the story unfolding in labs today shows us that personality isn't just a label. It's a networked reality in the architecture of your brain. Dr. Dario Nardi, a UCLA professor and one of the leading researchers in this space, has conducted extensive EEG studies mapping how different personality types engage their brains during problem-solving, reflection, and real-world tasks. What he found turned assumptions upside down. Individuals with dominant introverted intuition, like INFJs and INTJs, tend to show whole brain synchronization, meaning their brain regions light up in harmony like an orchestra, especially when imagining future scenarios. In contrast, dominant extroverted sensing types, like ESTPS and ESFPS, show rapid-fire activity in the sensory cortex, reacting with incredible precision to physical stimuli. Their brains are designed for speed, grounded in the here and now. This isn't speculation. These are reproducible, real-time brain scans. In one of Nardi's sessions, a subject with dominant thinking functions was asked to solve ethical dilemmas. Their prefrontal cortex lit up in isolated, analytical bursts. But when someone with dominant feeling took the same test, the orbitofrontal cortex and limbic system activated, showing a deep integration between emotion and decision-making. It's not that one is smarter, they're just neurologically different. And it goes deeper. A 2025 pilot study using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, FNIRS, revealed that extroverted sensing users experienced oxygenation spikes in the occipital lobe and visual cortex while watching fast-paced video scenes. Their brains quite literally absorb information through the eyes more rapidly and viscerally than others. Meanwhile, intuitive types engaged more activity in the default mode network, a system linked to imagination, daydreaming, and abstract thought. These findings are shaking the foundations of behavioral science, because they prove that personality isn't just behavior, it's biology. And yet, that doesn't mean we're prisoners of our wiring. Jung's point was never that you are only your dominant function. His insight was that awareness transforms wiring into will. Once you know which circuits light you up and which ones shut you down, you gain the ability to shift, stretch, and grow. And this is where it gets personal, because so many people live their lives trying to become someone they're not. A feeling type in a data-driven corporate role starts suppressing emotion. A sensing type in a chaotic, abstract environment begins doubting their instincts. Over time, the brain compensates by overfiring stress networks. Cortisol rises, cognitive fatigue sets in, and a sense of something's wrong with me begins to dominate. But there's nothing wrong. There's just disconnection from your natural function. In Nardi's book, The Neuroscience of Personality, he emphasizes that development doesn't mean becoming everything. It means integrating just enough of what you're missing to stabilize the system. Like learning to stretch a stiff muscle, not to become a gymnast, but to prevent injury. He offers exercises like brain mode profiling, where you match activities, puzzles, reflection prompts, conversations, to the function you want to awaken. And the feedback? People feel more energized, more themselves, more aligned. Imagine knowing your brain's favorite way to solve problems, or choosing a career path not based on trends, but based on your cortical strengths. This is no longer the realm of mystics or philosophers. It's hard science. And the better we understand it, the more power we have to stop resisting our minds and start working with them. Because now that we've seen the inner circuitry, we have to ask, why did evolution bother wiring us so differently in the first place? Why evolution bothered to make us so different? There's a reason we're not all wired the same. It's not a mistake. It's not inefficiency. It's design, ancient, biological, and strategic. Evolution didn't shape just your limbs, your reflexes, or your instincts. It shaped your mind. And what Carl Jung saw in personality types, evolutionary psychologists are now validating. Your dominant function isn't just personal, it's ancestral. Your way of perceiving and judging the world once gave your tribe a survival edge. Think back thousands of years. In a nomadic group moving through unknown lands, you didn't want everyone to be cautious. You didn't want everyone to be impulsive either. You needed balance. The person with dominant extroverted sensing, they became the hunter. Eyes scanning the terrain, quick reflexes, perfect timing with a thrown spear. The one with introverted intuition, the scout, reading signs, sensing future threats, feeling when to move camp even before danger appeared. Dominant feeling types held the social web together, mediating disputes, tuning into emotional shifts in the group that could explode into division. And the thinkers, they made decisions under pressure, cold, quick, efficient. Strategists, planners, problem solvers. Jung's theory of types fits right into this survival mosaic. Diversity of cognition wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Today we see this reflected in modern team dynamics. Research from Harvard Business School shows that teams with a mixture of personality types outperform homogeneous teams in both innovation and crisis resilience. Why? Because when one function hits its limit, another compensates. Your weakness is someone else's superpower. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson saw this diversity unfold across the lifespan too. In early life, we rely heavily on our dominant function. It's fast, natural, and reinforced by our environment. But as we age, especially in midlife, the auxiliary and tertiary functions begin to surface. It's not midlife crisis. It's the psyche demanding expansion. A young, extroverted thinker might chase goals and status with laser precision. But at 40, they start questioning meaning, value, legacy, signs their feeling function is knocking on the door. Lynn Hasher's lesser-known but groundbreaking book, Lifespan Development of Personality, explores this shift. She found that while younger brains lean toward specialization, older adults, especially after age 50, begin engaging neglected neural pathways. This isn't decline, it's adaptation. It's the mind preparing for legacy, wisdom, and balance. In fact, Hasher discovered that people who had done the work of acknowledging their weaker functions scored higher in long-term life satisfaction, even when facing illness or loss. This is what individuation looks like in real time. The personality isn't static. It's dynamic, and biology supports it. A study from the University of Zurich showed that gray matter density shifts over time in regions associated with different personality traits. In those who practiced conscious self-reflection or therapy aimed at integration, essentially facing their less dominant sides, neural growth was measurable. The brain doesn't just settle, it reconfigures. So next time you wonder why you're different from your siblings, your friends, your co-workers, remember this wasn't by accident. Nature needed each of you to fulfill a role. And modern life may have blurred the edges of those roles, but the architecture is still there. When we try to conform to one way of being, when schools, corporations, or cultures value one function over another, we create imbalance. But when we recognize what evolution intended, we return to something far more powerful: interdependence. You're not just your strengths, you're also someone else's missing piece, and they might be yours. Which is why, when personality types collide in relationships or workplaces, it's not always conflict, it's an opportunity, but only if we know how to read the signals. Group dynamics and workplace warfare. Walk into any modern workplace today, and beneath the productivity metrics, task lists, and Zoom calls, there's an invisible war being waged. It's not about office politics or corporate hierarchies. It's about psychological wiring, colliding cognitive functions trying to work together while speaking entirely different internal languages. The tension you feel in team meetings, the friction between departments, even the burnout. These aren't random. They're the direct outcome of misunderstood typology. Carl Jung's framework doesn't just help individuals, it explains why groups succeed or fail. When a dominant thinking type tries to manage a team of feelers without adjusting communication, decisions feel cold and detached. When an intuitive visionary proposes ideas to a group of sensing realists, they're met with skepticism, not resistance, just a different map of reality. The truth is, most workplace conflict isn't personal. It's functional. Let's go inside a real example. Google once conducted a large-scale internal study, known as Project Aristotle, to understand what made some teams outperform others. The result? Psychological safety was the #1 factor. But what fuels that safety? It turns out, it's the presence of complementary functions. Teams where members weren't all the same type, but learned how to recognize each other's style, performed better. That's pure Jungian theory in action. And the digital age is only accelerating this trend. Between 2023 and 2025, Google Trends reported a 70% increase in searches for INTJ, INFJ, and MBTI compatibility. Corporations have caught on. Amazon now uses a 2-pizza team rule. No team should be so large it can't be fed with 2 pizzas. But what's less talked about is how these teams are structured psychologically. One of their most effective combinations: ENTJ leaders paired with ISFP designers. The result? Fire meets flow. Innovation meets empathy. Execution meets nuance. This isn't speculation. Psychology Today published an analysis on this exact dynamic, showing that when teams are curated based on function compatibility, not just skill, retention improves, conflict drops, and innovation spikes. But there's a catch. Only if team members are taught the language of typology. Without it, introverted types may feel steamrolled. Sensors may feel the pressure of abstract goals. Thinkers might dismiss vital emotional cues as distractions. John Vittorio Caprara's underappreciated book, Type and Culture, takes this global. He argues that personality type isn't just individual, it's cultural. For example, Japan's preference for harmony and high-context communication mirrors a national tendency toward feeling and introverted sensing. The United States, with its focus on innovation and disruption, leans more intuition and extroverted thinking. And when teams span cultures without understanding these layers, it's not just language barriers, they're dealing with clashing mental functions. In corporate training sessions that integrate Jungian analysis, one of the most common breakthroughs happens when people stop personalizing behavior. The feeler no longer sees the thinker as cold, just wired for objective reasoning. The sensing type no longer sees the intuitive as scattered, just living in future-oriented patterns. These shifts reduce emotional friction. They don't remove differences. They make them usable. Here's something to think about. If your last job drained you, maybe it wasn't the work. Maybe it was the mismatch between your dominant function and the daily demands. An extroverted intuition type stuck in repetitive admin work will mentally suffocate. A sensing type forced into open-ended brainstorming might feel lost, even incompetent. This isn't about talent, it's about alignment. And now, with AI tools scanning resumes, LinkedIn phrasing, and communication styles, even algorithms are trying to map this alignment. But without conscious awareness, we're just reinforcing the same patterns, promoting loud voices over thoughtful ones, choosing efficiency over empathy. To really thrive in modern group dynamics, we don't just need diversity of gender, race, or background. We need cognitive diversity. And the only way to unlock it is to stop asking who's right and start asking what function is speaking. But there's a darker side to this too. Because when certain personality types understand how others think, but use it not to connect, but to control, that's where the shadow of typology emerges. It's called manipulation, and it's rising fast. Dark psychology. Alert. When types manipulate. Not all self-awareness leads to harmony. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. Knowing how someone thinks, feels, and processes the world can open doors, or it can be used to trap them inside their own psychology. Carl Jung warned that the unconscious, when left in shadow, doesn't disappear. It controls. And when people harness the cognitive functions of others, not to build connection, but to twist perception, we enter the domain of dark psychology. Enter the dark empath, a term that's exploded across platforms like TikTok and Instagram over the past 2 years. At first glance, they appear kind, emotionally intelligent, even deeply compassionate. But behind the mask is a carefully calibrated mix of empathy and manipulation. The dark empath doesn't lack empathy. They weaponize it. They read people with precision, not to comfort, but to control. Their dominant function might be extroverted feeling, sensing group mood, emotional temperature, social nuance, but it's fused with traits from the dark triad: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. The Guardian recently featured a series on this archetype, warning that dark empaths are increasingly seen in leadership positions, social media influence, and toxic relationships. They're the ones who seem to know exactly what to say when you're vulnerable, and later use it against you. They don't explode. They erode, slowly, strategically. And when you finally question their motives, they make you feel guilty for asking. Joe Navarro, in his penetrating book Dangerous Personalities, outlines psychological profiles of manipulators based on years of work with the FBI. One striking case involves a woman with a classic INFJ cognitive stack, introverted intuition and extroverted feeling, who used her deep insight into others' emotional patterns to isolate and psychologically exhaust her partner. Navarro emphasizes that the most dangerous manipulators aren't those who yell. They're the ones who smile while unraveling your sense of self. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes critical. Every cognitive function has a light side and a dark side. Feeling types can become people pleasers or emotional tyrants. Thinking types can become clear-headed leaders or ruthless logicians who justify harm. Intuitives can inspire new realities or dissociate entirely, manipulating others with visions that never arrive. Sensors can protect structure or imprison others in micromanagement. Psychologist Kevin Dutton's research at Oxford shows that manipulative behavior often aligns not with lack of intelligence, but with a very specific kind of awareness. In his studies, individuals high in what he calls Machiavellian intelligence are often adept at mimicking empathy, adjusting tone and language to match their target, and using typological knowledge as a tool of persuasion. They know how thinkers respond to logic, how feelers respond to stories, how sensors react to urgency, and how intuitives are lured by possibilities. When this knowledge is used with no moral compass, it becomes coercion disguised as connection. Even in therapy, this can be dangerous. A client with high self-knowledge can sometimes manipulate the therapist, saying the right things, avoiding the real ones. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani Durvasula, in her lectures on narcissistic personality traits, often warns that intelligent manipulators don't always lie. They frame the truth, removing just enough context that their story sounds reasonable, while keeping others in confusion and guilt. So how do you protect yourself? The first step is to understand your own function's blind spot. If you lead with feeling, you might be vulnerable to guilt-based control. If you lead with intuition, someone could trap you in future promises. If you're a thinker, flattery about your logic can be used to bypass your emotional instincts. And if you're a sensor, pressure to act now can override your slow, accurate perception. The key isn't paranoia, it's clarity. When you understand your cognitive wiring, you stop giving others the keys to your mind. You recognize persuasion, yes, but you also spot coercion. You learn to pause when something feels almost right, Because that's how manipulation works. It's never a hard push. It's a carefully placed suggestion that fits just enough with your dominant function to slip through the cracks. And now, in a world where digital algorithms are mapping these same functions in real time, the manipulation isn't just interpersonal, it's automated. That's the next frontier we're walking into. Tech, AI, and the personality data gold rush. Imagine this. You haven't spoken a word, but a machine already knows if you're more intuitive than sensing, more feeling than thinking. Your personality type, once buried under layers of experience and introspection, is now being predicted by algorithms, ads, and AI models, sometimes more accurately than even you realize. This is not a glimpse into the future. It's already happening, and it's happening faster than we're prepared for. The digital world you interact with, likes, shares, typing speed, scrolling patterns, isn't just collecting data. It's building a behavioral fingerprint. Research from Stanford and Cambridge University revealed that by analyzing just 200 Facebook likes, a machine learning model could predict a user's MBTI type more accurately than their friends could. By 500 likes, it could outperform spouses. These aren't just personality traits. These are cognitive functions being inferred from passive behavior, then sold to advertising platforms that know how to press your internal buttons. LinkedIn has started experimenting with subtle forms of typology reading, analyzing job descriptions, sentence structure and bios, even time spent on certain types of posts. Recruiters are now using AI-powered platforms that identify whether you're more judging or perceiving based on your response time to messages. Career platforms scrape public content, drawing conclusions about whether you'd thrive in fast-paced creative roles or structured analytical environments, all without asking you a single question. Flynn Coleman, in her revealing book, The Human Algorithm, warns that while AI can mirror and learn human behavior, it lacks moral reasoning. When predictive technology is deployed without ethical guardrails, personality becomes commodified. Algorithms predict your next purchase, your dating preferences, even your voting behavior, not based on your values, but on your functional biases. If you're a high intuition type, you'll get ads for future planning tools, abstract investments, or self-development programs. If you're a sensing type, the focus shifts to tangible upgrades, sensory-rich experiences, and real-world convenience. The problem is not that these predictions are inaccurate, it's that they're too accurate. And when they reinforce your dominant function without challenging it, they trap you inside a cognitive echo chamber. Over time, you stop being surprised by new experiences. Your media diet becomes saturated with what you already think, and your auxiliary or inferior functions, the very parts of you that enable growth, are left unfed. The American Psychological Association raised a concern in 2025 about personality-based targeting, particularly in the context of digital addiction. They found that apps designed around your cognitive type, especially feeling or intuitive functions, can manipulate emotional loops, increasing screen time through carefully timed notifications, immersive design, and emotionally triggering content. The dopamine cycle is no longer generic. It's personalized. Even education platforms are beginning to tailor content delivery by typology. Students identified as extroverted thinkers receive bullet point overviews and quizzes. Those flagged as introverted feelers are fed narrative-driven, reflective exercises. While it sounds efficient, it also raises a question. If your growth lies in your less developed functions, should technology always give you what's easiest? Jung believed that individuation required conscious struggle, that we grow not through confirmation, but through tension. And in this age, the tension has become digital. The very platforms that promise to help us understand ourselves may also be locking us into curated psychological loops. But this doesn't have to be a trap. With awareness, these tools can become mirrors, not cages. If you know your digital footprint is being analyzed for typology, you can begin to ask harder questions. Why am I being shown this? Is this strengthening my dominant function or reinforcing a blind spot? And perhaps most importantly, am I still choosing, truly choosing, how to respond? Because this next step isn't about resisting tech. It's about reclaiming agency, about using psychological insight to consciously evolve, not as a product, but as a person. And that leads us back to what Jung cared most about. Not just knowing the functions, but integrating them, turning what you've suppressed into strength, and learning how to stretch into the uncomfortable. Because that's where transformation begins. Individuation, turning weakness into power. There's a turning point in every person's journey when you realize that your greatest breakthroughs won't come from doing more of what you're good at. They'll come from exploring what you've avoided. That's the essence of individuation, the psychological process Carl Jung believed to be at the heart of human growth. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more yourself by integrating the hidden, ignored, and often uncomfortable parts of your psyche. For most of your life, your dominant function has been in charge. It got you through school. It shaped your identity. It carved out a career, filtered your relationships, even dictated what kind of hobbies you enjoy. But over time, it becomes less satisfying. You start to sense there's more, something deeper calling you. That more isn't out there. It's inside. And it usually starts with a kind of tension. Maybe you're successful but feel emotionally hollow. Maybe you're deeply compassionate but chronically disorganized. Maybe you dream big but struggle to act. That tension is the gateway. Because the function you've neglected, your inferior, or your undeveloped auxiliary, isn't a weakness to fix. It's the very portal to wholeness. And Jung believed the psyche is always pushing us toward that wholeness, whether we cooperate or not. When we don't, it shows up as projection, anxiety, depression, or burnout. When we do, it becomes transformation. So how do you actually do individuation? Start simple. Shadow journaling is one method Jung suggested in his own practice. 14 days of writing, where you observe your reactions to others and ask, what am I really seeing in them that I'm not willing to see in myself? You'll notice recurring patterns. Maybe you're irritated by someone's indecisiveness because you suppress your own vulnerability, or you're uncomfortable around people who express raw emotion because you've buried your own. The page becomes a mirror, and slowly, the unconscious becomes conscious. Next, use what Jung would call function switching exercises. If you're high on intuition, try engaging the sensing world. Detailed cooking, tactile art, mindful walking, where you focus only on sights, sounds, and textures. If you're a dominant feeler, spend a day solving problems using data and logic, no emotions allowed. It's uncomfortable. That's the point. These small, targeted challenges aren't about mastering new skills. They're about loosening the grip your dominant function has on your perception. Murray Stein, in his underappreciated but profound book, Individuation, Inner Work for Self-Realization, outlines the final piece, what he calls the social feedback loop. This isn't just introspection. You need reflection from others. Trusted friends, therapists, even intimate partners can serve as sounding boards. Ask them, what do you think I ignore? What do you see that I don't? Sometimes their answers sting. That's a good sign. You're hitting the unconscious edge. And science supports this. A 2022 study published in Neuropsychology found that people who engaged in tasks challenging their less preferred cognitive styles showed increased functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and subcortical structures. Translation: the brain becomes more integrated. Decision-making becomes more balanced. You stop reacting purely from instinct and start responding from wholeness. This is where true psychological strength lives. Not in perfection, but in flexibility. The thinker who learns to sit with emotional discomfort becomes more human. The feeler who learns to set logical boundaries becomes more stable. The sensor who embraces ambiguity becomes more creative. The intuitive who grounds their vision in the present becomes more impactful. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and brilliant psychiatrist, once wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. In our choice lies our growth and our freedom. Individuation is the expansion of that space. The more you bring your full psychological self into awareness, the more freedom you gain to live consciously, not as a slave to your patterns, but as the author of your own mind. And this is the invitation. Not to label yourself as one type forever, but to use that knowledge as a doorway, to grow, to stretch, to become larger than the pattern you started with. Because you are not a personality type, you are a psyche in evolution. Now that you've met your functions, dominant, auxiliary, inferior, it's time to bring them all online. It's time to stop living on autopilot and start showing up with your full battery. Stop living on 25% battery. The world keeps telling you to be more of what you already are. Double down, optimize, specialize. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if real fulfillment comes not from perfecting your dominant side, but from reclaiming the parts of you you've left behind? Most people live their entire lives on 25% battery, running only on their dominant function, sometimes barely supported by a half-developed auxiliary. That's why so many feel burned out, restless, or stuck. It's not that life is broken. It's that the psyche is underfed. Carl Jung didn't design the typology system so you could slap a label on yourself and move on. He built it as a map, a guide back to your whole self, a mirror to see not just who you are, but who you could be if you dared to turn inward and face the unfamiliar. You now know more than most people ever will about how your mind works. You've learned about the attitudes that guide your energy, the 4 functions that shape your every perception and decision, the brain signatures that validate them, the evolutionary roles that embedded them into our species, the dark side of typology when used to manipulate, and the digital age that's now profiling you in real time. But most importantly, you've learned how to reclaim your own psychology, how to listen to the shadow, how to stretch into discomfort, how to step off the path of automatic behavior and into conscious awareness. So now, it's your move. Which function have you ignored? Which one scares you, or embarrasses you, or drains you? That's your starting point. Try journaling. Try a new task that activates a different part of your psyche. Try observing your inner conflict without judgment. And when you're ready, share it. In the comments. With a friend. In your next conversation. Tell someone what you're learning about how you function. Because the moment you say it out loud, you're no longer just thinking. You're integrating. This journey doesn't end here. There's more to explore. Like the shadow archetypes, the psychology of dark empaths, and the real methods for rewiring your subconscious mind. But for now, sit with this. You're not just one function, you're all of them, waiting to be noticed, strengthened, and brought into harmony. The question isn't, who am I? It's, who am I still becoming? And the answer? That's entirely up to you.